I started in radio, television shows, commercials, corporate videos, but my dream was always to become a film composer, to write music for movies, orchestral dramatic music, which I finally got my chance when I was 21, which was, I thought, late. I worked really hard since I was about 12 professionally. Once I did my first film, everything takes off from there. I've done 60 feature films since then. I like to do those independent horror films, suspense thrillers, psychological thrillers, you know, like a Hitchcock film, or art house films. I've done several of those. I've been doing this for about, I'm 40 now, so, and I started when I was 12. So I actually have about 28 years of experience at 40 years old, professional experience. And I started going to college when I was 11. So I have a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom that I'd like to pass on to you guys. Yeah, long time. And I invite you to ask me any questions about the art and the craft, and I'm happy to answer. What was my big turning point? Okay, well, they say you can't get a film unless you've done a film. So that's a really huge catch-22. Actually, my first film was somebody called me who I had taken some, I think it was the brother of somebody I had taken some music classes with in college. And he was the brother of somebody that worked at MGM. He had recommended, his brother had recommended me to him because he didn't have any experience scoring pictures, scoring movies. Yet his brother at MGM gave him this film from a friend of a friend, a little independent film, which is actually now by a big company called the Asylum. You may have heard of them. They did like Sharknado and all those movies. But I did their first movie score. It was a movie called Killers. What happened was that brother was needing someone with a little experience, knowledge of the craft, and a studio to do it. And so we partnered, and he was a really great guy. If you take a listen to that soundtrack for that movie Killers by David Michael Latt and David Ramawi of the Asylum, again, that's the Sharknado fame, those guys. And like one of those movies, giant octopus versus, you know, whatever. You know, I did five or six pictures with them in the beginning of their studio. And now they do like those kind of like knockoffs, like Transmorphers and that kind of thing. Yeah, the movie's called Killers. That was my first film, and it was in partner with this other dude. And so that was one turning point. Okay, then the next turning point was probably 20 or so, 30 films later. I did the score for a picture called The Poker Club. And that was directed by and starring and produced by Jonathan Sheck. He's the lead singer in That Thing You Do, that film That Thing You Do, and he was in Prom Night, and he's a big actor. He's in a lot of films. Jonathan Sheck. That is when I really put down my signature voice for that film, The Poker Club. You can check that score out on my YouTube channel, on my website, on Twitter. You know, there should be links everywhere to that particular score. It's one I'm very proud of. And that was really my turning point where I was able to become myself as a composer and have a sound that's recognizable and has signatures, and that's powerful and enjoyable and mature. Yeah, thanks for that question. Do I use modes a lot? My father was jazz pianist Bill Evans, who brought the classical modes into jazz. That was his idea. In the late 30s, that was his idea. Then he worked with Miles Davis, of course, on Kind of Blue, to apply modes to jazz, and that was called, you know, the birth of the cool, you know, cool jazz. Now myself, I'm kind of a chromatic composer. I think, you know, when you get to a certain point with film scoring, you're more or less applying gestures and phrases, and you're trying to reach for emotional aspects of the film. So trying to get locked into any kind of system is not a good idea. That's why I say I'm a chromatic composer. I'm basically a free composer is what I like to call it. I create phrases, you know, using the orchestra, and I like to sprinkle on some interesting sounds on top of that. I see you have Mackie speakers. Why those? And what would you suggest to get started? And how did you get your first gig? I just talked about how I got my first gig, so I might come back to that for you, but I'm gonna answer those other two first. Those speakers are Mackie's. Okay, sure. Yeah, I bought them because they sounded incredible. If you like, I can check which model they are. The MR5 MK3s. And I really wouldn't normally buy a Mackie. You know, I was in the market for a Genelex because, you know, I really wanted an absolutely fantastic, pristine sound. But I demoed about 40 different monitors for several weeks, actually, going back and forth, A/B testing this against that, ranking, you know, positive benefits, everything. And eventually I actually settled on these, even over bigger speakers, and they're not that expensive. So it wasn't really about the price, you know. It was just, you know, it's one of those bottles of wines that was just a really great taste that happened to be at a good price. They're perfect for composing. Okay, so and they're okay for mastering because they're fairly flat. But they have a larger bass end and a nice crisp high end. They're very responsive, so if you're going to do like taiko drumming, you can get when you're hitting those drums, it doesn't muddy up the mid-range. You get a lot of clarity out of these. But they're very exciting speakers. So, you know, when you're doing film music, you know, you want to really be excited because it's long hours. It can be 14 to 18 hours per day, sometimes 2 or 3 days in a row, nonstop without sleep, because you're trying to produce, you know, 90, 100 minutes of full orchestral music in 20 or 30 or 40 days. It's a big feat. And it's always wonderful when it's over, but it's also exciting to do while you're working. And yeah, you need speakers that are going to be exciting. And the other question was, and by the way, about getting what was my first gig, I think, as somebody mentioned. So I'll just a brief overview. I got my first professional gig when I was 12, writing for a 42-minute CD-ROM, which is what they were back then. It was by Philips Interactive CDI, called Shark Alert, and I did about 42 minutes of music for that. And you know, I did radio and commercials and TV and corporate videos, documentaries, all the way up until 21. When I was 17, I moved to LA and started going to UCLA and studying the film scoring at that college, and basically sending out tons and tons of CDs and resumes every week. But it took 3 years to get my first film at the age of 21. Because, like I explained before, you can't get a movie unless you've done a movie. They're not going to, I mean, when they've got 100 choices in front of them, and they've got composers that can do what they say they can do, and have a record of it, versus you, and you've got nothing, and you're just like, oh, you know, but I really can do it. Yeah, right. Well, you can't. It's a catch-22. So, like I explained, my first real film gig I got because somebody else wanted to partner with me because they didn't have a studio and they knew that I could compose. And we did the film score together and are credited together. And that was Killers by the Asylum, the guys that do Sharknado. And so that's how I got my first gig. And from there, right after that, I just said, you know, I'm not interested in any more partnerships. I've got my credit, my feather in my cap. I should be able to get my own pictures. And yeah, right after that, I did a Rebecca De Mornay film with Micah Rooker. And I did another film called Future Murder, which is a little hard to get these days, but actually it's a really good film. But it was a very low budget independent film. And I've done 60 movies since then, including running the Composer Collective, which was a composing firm of 3,000 composers. And I was the CEO of that, and we managed all the composers. So you said, what do I recommend to begin? Well, I think you should get the software Digital Performer. It's both for PC and both for Mac. It's good for just basic songwriting and putting in an idea. It can even do notation if you want to do everything by notation. And it goes all the way up through to like a full-on Pro Tools type of environment. And then even further all the way to a full-blown, 400-track MIDI sequence with all kinds of software instruments loaded up in effects, and then 100 cues all loaded, all at the same time. So I really recommend Digital Performer. I've used Logic for many years, and way back in the days, I was a big fan of Studio Vision Pro from Opcode. You guys, I'm gonna be back in perhaps about 10 minutes. Tell me how much you liked this. I'm going to actually check to make sure this recorded okay, and that we're gonna be able to put this on YouTube later. Okay, looking forward to it. See you soon.